Setting up our development environment for Angular 2 requires two basic steps. Make npm Node Package Manager available and set up the Angular 2 application. There's no need to manually install Angular 2 or TypeScript or any other library, which is very nice. However, this step 2 is really quite an involved process. Let's look at the one very important tool we'll need to use regardless of how we approach setting up our application. This tool is npm. If you're not familiar, npm, or Node Package Manager, is a command-line utility that interacts with a repository of open-source projects. npm has become the package manager for JavaScript. In using npm, we can install libraries, packages, and applications along with their dependencies. We will need npm to install all of the libraries for Angular 2 and to execute scripts to transpile our code and launch our application. Fortunately for us, npm is available by default in our Cloud9 environment. We don't have to worry about installing it and setting it up. It's just there for us. As I just stated, setting up an Angular 2 application can be quite laborious, kind of confusing, and very, very involved. However, there are options which we will explore. Before we begin, let's list the required steps and then look at ways we can set up Angular 2 without actually performing all of these steps. To manually set up an Angular 2 application, we would need to create an application folder, create the tsconfig file to configure the TypeScript compiler, create the package.json file to define the libraries and scripts that we need, create the typings.json file that specifies a missing TypeScript type definition file, install the libraries and typings files, create the host web page, normally index.html, and create the main.ts file to bootstrap the Angular 2 application with the root component. Obviously, this is an exhaustive list. Fortunately, we have some options for setting up an Angular 2 project. We can manually perform each of these steps. The detailed instructions for each step are provided in the Angular 2 documentation on angular.io. Another option is to simply download the quick start files from Angular.io, or alternatively, we could use tooling such as Angular CLI. Angular CLI is a command-line tool for generating the set of files and boilerplate code for Angular 2 applications, including scaffolding, unit test, and end-to-end tests. This sounds like a pretty good option. However, at the time of this recording, the Angular CLI library is still a work in progress for Angular 2, and it's not yet released in a stable version. But feel free to give it a try and keep an eye on its progress. To keep the monotonous work for our course project application to a minimum, I prepared another option, a course project application starter kit. This consists of the initial files needed for the course project application. These files are available in my GitHub repository, and we cloned those when we set up our initial project. In addition to the basic setup files for an Angular 2 application, the starter kit includes extra files we need as we build out the course project application. We have obviously gone with this option and eliminated many of the headaches that are involved when learning how to set up an Angular 2 application. Let's look at the content of the starter kit. First, let's talk about the directory structure. By convention, all of the files specific for our application are within a directory called app. There are only a few subdirectories and files as we start building the project, and that's okay. We will add more as we progress. Angular 2 applications of any size will have subdirectories under the app directory for each major feature in the application. These files in the app directory are all setup files. To get moving with all of the material in this course, we won't dive into these files now, but we'll learn what these files are, what they contain, and what they do in a section called Angular 2 Setup Detailed, which we'll experience towards the end of the course. The last thing we need to do is install all of the libraries required to develop and run our application. So from the command prompt, we need to be sure we're in the root folder for our application. The starter kit project was built using Gulp. Gulp will become a great friend as it does many of the menial tasks in the development process that we do not want to have to do ourselves. So our first step to finalize our project setup is to install Gulp globally in our environment. This is a simple task. We go to the terminal and ensure that we are in our root directory, and we type npm install --global gulp and hit enter and Gulp will be installed via npm. Now, with Gulp installed at the global context, we can now run our npm install, which will consult our package.json file and see which libraries and dependencies have to be installed for our project. It's a simple command, npm install, and hit enter, and the installation process will start. Note that you may see some warnings and errors during the installation process. No worries though, in most cases they can be ignored. If you see something like this tree structure, when it quiets down, the install completed successfully. You may see different version numbers than those shown here. That's okay too. If the process ended with an error, try running npm install a second time. That often completes the installation successfully. So back in the editor, notice that we now have a new nodes module directory. This is where npm installed all of our libraries. There is also a new typings directory where the TypeScript definition file was placed. We'll talk more about the TypeScript definition files in the Angular 2 setup detailed section of this course. There's one last bit of housekeeping that we need to do before we run our application, and that is to clean up the typings folder. The typings were produced for browser and for main. We'll only be using typings in the browser, and the main typings need to go. So we can delete main.d.ts, and then we can delete the whole main directory. To get us going, the starter kit includes enough code to run the course project application right out of the box. Let's give it a try. At the command prompt in the root directory, enter npm start, and the start script runs. And we can see that Gulp was called. Gulp then takes over and gets our app up and running. Let's see what we have in the browser. The application doesn't look like much here at the get-go, but we'll build the application out as we progress through the course. Looking back at the code, note that we now have JS file and a map file for each of our TS files. The start script started this TypeScript compiler, which transpiled all of the TypeScript files, the .ts files, to ES5 JavaScript files that the browser can display. The map file is a source map that is generated by the compiler to help debug TypeScript code. We don't need to worry about any missing files at this point, as we will create them as we move along. When we are finished working with the browser, we can just simply close it, but the compiler and file server keep running. To stop them, press Ctrl+C with the terminal active. Use npm start anytime you want to run the application, and keep it running as you continue to code.